I'm Terry Martin. You also have Trudy Cherisaro. Dr. Cherisaro is on screen with me, and we are here to talk about examining evaluator feedback in teacher evaluation systems. We have some webinar goals, and one of them, of course, is to introduce the survey. And the thing that we would like for you to think about when we talk about introducing the survey is, what is it and what does it mean for me? So as you're hearing about the survey, put in your head that you're thinking, okay, I know this stuff, but do I really have a good definition of it? And do I know what it means for me, what I'm going to do about it? We're also going to discuss the survey development. And as we discuss the development process and how it all came to be, something you might want to be thinking about is, how are you going to share this information with others? Is it relevant to others that you work with, that surrounding people? And think about how you might share that information. And then last, we will discuss how to use the survey. And we'll actually even get you into an action step in regard to that. And so definitely think about, personally, how would I use this survey? Is this a survey that is something that I would use? Or once again, going back to, or is this something that I need to share with somebody else because I think it'd be very relevant for them? So keep those things in mind.
Great. So as Terry said, we wanted to welcome you all to this survey, and we're going to be, or to this webinar. We're going to be talking about a survey tool that we developed for gathering perceptions about evaluator feedback that teachers have about their evaluator feedback. So I wanted to start by giving you a little bit of background and what the purpose of the research in the survey was. As you all are aware, most states are implementing new teacher evaluation systems that are focused on providing feedback to teachers to improve practice. A lot of states started doing that under the ESEA waivers and are continuing to do it even though it's not a priority in the ESSA regulations. States in the central region, when we began the REL contract, expressed an interest in learning more about how teachers perceive the feedback that they're receiving from evaluators. And so to address this need, REL Central developed a survey to gather information about teachers' perceptions of the use of feedback, and then also conducted a study to examine the influence of certain characteristics of feedback and how that influenced teachers' response to feedback. So there are two reports that are available related to the work that we're discussing today. The one on the left, the yellow one, is actually the Examining Evaluator Feedback Survey, and this is a tool where it provides a survey and some other resources, and that's one that we're going to be talking more in depth about today. And that one gives the results of the actual study that we conducted using the survey that we're speaking of today. So the research study sought to address three research questions. First, we wanted to just understand what teachers' perceptions were of the usefulness and accuracy of feedback, of evaluator credibility, and of the access to resources that they might have to respond to the feedback that they got. Then we also wanted to look at the relationship of those different characteristics and then how those characteristics influence whether or not teachers responded to feedback. So this theoretical model actually depicts the hypothesized relationships that we were trying to address in those research questions. So as you can see, the three feedback characteristics, accuracy, usefulness, and evaluator credibility, we believe that those three things are related and that they in turn influence how teachers respond to feedback, and then also that whether or not teachers have access to resources that help them to implement feedback influences whether or not they're going to respond to feedback. So I'm going to turn it over to Terry, and she's going to conduct an activity.
And I wanted to wait a little bit before, we were just talking about, well, Trudy was just talking about evaluator credibility, and we wanted to get started with this webinar so that you would know a little bit about what we're going to talk about. But I do want to pause for a minute because in regard to credibility, I didn't introduce Trudy at the beginning, and I want to introduce her now. He is the author of this report. REL Central is located at Marzano Research, and so Trudy and I both work at Marzano Research. Trudy is the director of our research department at Marzano Research and the deputy director of REL Central at Marzano Research. Thinking about this whole process, both of us have been educators. I was a principal and a teacher for over 20 years, and so we understand about teacher evaluation and the importance of feedback. And we want to look at each one of these questions, the the accuracy, usefulness, and credibility of feedback, and we want you to take a little bit of time to think about that too.
So we sort of had to do the same thing in creating the survey. We had to define those characteristics that we were interested in collecting information about. So we, gathered information from existing research. We looked at our experiences in conducting research on other evaluation systems and information that we had received from teachers, either through surveys that we conducted or focus groups, and thought about how we would really try to define these different characteristics. So in thinking about useful feedback, we thought that this would be feedback that would be specific, would provide very specific recommendations, and would be provided in a timely manner, meaning that if teachers received it soon enough after they were observed or after artifacts were reviewed, that they could actually remember and understand to make changes to their practice. Also, another important piece of it being useful was that it was provided frequently. So teachers got feedback often enough that they could really think about how to change their practice. And thinking about whether or not the feedback was credible, or the evaluator was credible, we thought that that would be including things like the person who was providing the feedback had knowledge and understanding to give valuable feedback. So that would be knowledge about the context, the students that you're working with, knowledge about the content or the subject area that you're teaching, and also even knowledge about the evaluation system that was being used to conduct observations. And thinking about whether or not feedback is accurate, we think that that really gets to whether or not teachers, when they're receiving feedback, think that that feedback really represents their performance. So was it happening at a time where it was a typical day in their classroom where someone came in and conducted an observation, so that it was really an accurate representation of their teaching throughout the year. And then the final thing was thinking about access to resources. So whether or not teachers could talk to expert teachers, mentors, or observe other teachers, implementing strategies that they wanted to learn about that would help them to gain skills and knowledge necessary to really respond to the feedback that they had received. So using those definitions, we went through a pretty extensive and iterative development process to develop the survey. So we started with those definitions and drafted a set of questions that would gather feedback from teachers about each of those characteristics. Then we conducted an advisory panel review, and then based on that review, we revised the survey. Then we conducted teacher interviews to gather feedback from teachers as well. Then based on that feedback, we revised the survey again. Then finally, we examined the reliability and validity of the survey and made some revisions based on that, and resulting in a final survey. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these steps moving forward. So for the advisory panel, we had 7 members, which included leaders from states who were leading the educator evaluation system in the state, from districts who were also leaders who were leading the educator evaluation systems in the district, and then also some expert survey developers, so researchers who focused on developing surveys and how to do that best. We conducted a web meeting with the 7 members, so they received the survey ahead of time and were able to review all the survey questions ahead of time. And then we asked about the clarity of the questions, the applicability of the questions, and the appropriateness of the questions. So for example, we asked the panel members if there are any questions that might be hard to interpret or understand, kind of given the context in which their teachers were being evaluated. So we did learn that we needed to expand a question about teachers having access to a mentor or coach to support them in implementing feedback, to describe this a little bit more broadly as teachers having access to an instructional leader that could include a peer, a coach, a mentor, or even an administrator, because different districts had different ways of providing these types of support. So in some instances, there wasn't a formal mentor or a formal coach, so we wanted to make sure that we were capturing where teachers might be providing that or getting that type of support without defining it in a too narrow of a fashion. So based on the advisory panel review, we revised a few questions, the wording of some questions, and then we administered the survey to a handful of teachers. 9 of those teachers were invited to participate in interviews, and during these interviews we also asked them about questions about the clarity and understandability and relevance of the questions on the survey. So all the teachers completed the survey first, and then they participated in a follow-up interview, and they were asked to think about whether or not the questions were relevant or appropriate for them as a teacher, if the directions were clear, and if there were also to try to identify if there were any terms that they might be interpreting different than we meant them to interpret the terms. So for example, on question 2 of the survey is asking teachers to indicate who their designated evaluator was. So we wanted to make sure that teachers were talking about feedback that they received from their official evaluator, where they might receive feedback from, if they have a coach who's coming in and observing them, they could receive feedback from the coach, but it wasn't really as part of the evaluation system. So we had used the term designated evaluator, and we wanted to make sure that when teachers were thinking about that term, that meant the same thing to them, that it meant the person who was responsible for their official formal evaluation. Another example is we asked whether or not 2 different questions, questions 3 and 4, were clear. And those questions were about whether or not they had received written feedback and whether or not they had received oral feedback. And we ended up landing on the terms written feedback and a feedback conversation, because we wanted to get a sense of how often teachers had been provided with formal written feedback and also had more informal feedback conversations with their evaluator. So those are some things that we thought about and adjusted based on the teacher interviews. Then we also conducted a pilot test where we administered the survey to approximately 200 teachers and then examined the reliability and validity of the survey using various methods. So for the first piece that we looked at for validity was conducting a confirmatory factor analysis to try to make sure that those categories or characteristics that we were talking about were actually really measuring what we thought they were, that they were related, but they were sort of their own unique categories. So we did find that the categories of usefulness, accuracy, credibility, access to resources, and responsiveness were 5 distinct categories being measured on the survey. We did end up rewording one question about the timeliness based on the confirmatory factor analysis. Originally the question said my evaluator's feedback was provided within an appropriate time frame, but we ended up revising it. Actually, we got this kind of feedback throughout the whole entire process to come up with a question that was my evaluator's feedback was provided in time for me to use it to inform my practice. So based on all the different reviews that we had, we saw that that question seemed to have a little bit of challenge, so we ended up rewording that. Then we also looked at the reliability, and the survey had evidence of reliability with high internal consistency. As you can see, the Chromebox alphas are all 0.8 or above, so pretty high internal consistency. And based on the results of the analysis, we also ended up collapsing the response option. So originally we had from strongly disagree to strongly agree 6 different options for responding, and we changed that to be 5 options with a more neutral option where respondents could say that they neither agree nor disagree. So as a result of all of this review and analysis, we ended up with a final survey where accuracy of feedback looked at teachers' perceptions and asked questions like whether or not, a more general question, just whether or not they thought that it was an accurate portrayal of their teaching, whether observations represented a typical day. So that might be, you know, if they came in and observed on Halloween, then it might not be the standard day that you're going to be teaching and might not really represent what your teaching looks like the rest of the year. Whether or not you would receive the same feedback if different evidence was collected. So that got at beyond teacher observations, if you're also collecting certain artifacts and you had collected different lesson plans or different information, would you still get the same feedback? And then another piece that seemed to be important to capture was whether or not teachers thought they would receive the same feedback if it was a different evaluator but using the same evidence. So does it sort of, do you have that consistency? In terms of the usefulness of feedback, we have questions that ask about whether or not it was provided in time to use it, whether or not it was provided frequently, if it included specific suggestions for strategies for classroom management and related to content and subject knowledge, and whether or not the feedback included recommendations for resources to access. In terms of evaluator credibility, the questions ended up being about the evaluator's understanding of the evaluation system that was being used and the curriculum, and then also the evaluator's knowledge of just effective teaching practices in general, how students learn and how the students in that classroom learn, and then also the content and subject area. And then the other two areas that are on the survey are the access to resources, where we ask teachers to report whether or not they have access to professional development opportunities, they have access to an instructional leader, which was the question I was talking about earlier, that could include mentors, coaches, administrators, or just expert teachers, whether or not they had an opportunity to observe an expert teacher modeling strategies, and another one was whether or not they had time to plan on how they might adjust their strategies. And this was all in response to the feedback that they had received. And then the final set of questions on the survey look at how teachers actually responded to the feedback. So we asked teachers to report on whether or not they changed the way that they plan instruction, whether or not they sought advice from an instructional leader once they received the feedback, whether or not they sought professional development opportunities related to the feedback, and whether or not they tried a new instructional strategy or tried new classroom management strategies. Now that we talked about how the survey was developed, we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about how you can use the survey and talk about what's available in the tool that can help you with using the survey. So in that published tool, it includes information about the specific research questions that you could address using the survey, and talks about how to actually analyze the data. So here's a table that has a lot of examples, but one example is that you could look at all teachers or look at specific subgroups of teachers. So if you thought that maybe your teachers who were teaching arts or PE might have a harder time getting good feedback from the evaluator, or that they might not think that the evaluator is as credible because they might not have that type of experience, then you could actually pull those groups of teachers out and see if their responses look different than other teachers. So another thing that you can do is just look at teachers' responses to an individual question. So you can just look at the % agreement of teachers' response to one of the questions, or you can actually look at responses in aggregate to one of the categories. So an example of that is you could take the category of usefulness and actually just look at the % of teachers that agreed with all of the questions in that usefulness category. So if you didn't want to try to figure out each of those specific questions, you could just have a statement that was something like 52% of teachers agreed or strongly agreed that they received useful feedback. And you can do that because of the way that the survey was developed and that we did test it using that confirmatory factor analysis. So we do know that as long as you're administering all of those questions, that those do hold together as a category. So also in the tool, there's a table that provides possible responses that could be used to address needs related to each of the categories. So, for example, if you administered the survey and found that most teachers did not agree that they had access to the resources that they need to implement the feedback that they receive, you might consider thinking about either increasing the number of professional development resources available at the district, or trying to make those more related to the type of feedback or the the issues that were being seen on the evaluations. You could also think about scheduling changes to try to allow for more job-embedded professional development. So that actually might look at how the schedule in the day is looking and whether or not teachers could have time to collaborate and coordinate with other expert teachers to learn. You could think about implementing peer or mentor coaching models. So again, allowing some of that access to teachers to see how other people do this, or establishing partnerships with post-secondary institutions to have them come in and maybe do some sharing or training of how to do how to improve practice, or even thinking about using the evaluation data to determine the focus of the professional development. So you could actually look at where there seem to be holes across all teachers in terms of where they're seeing weaknesses in their evaluation and try to target professional development related to that. So the table actually walks through examples of how you might respond within each of those feedback characteristics. And there's some narrative within the tool that talks about some of those examples as well. And then finally, we wanted to share that if you are interested in administering the survey, the PDF version of it is available in that tool. Also on the REL Central website, there is a Word version of the survey that you could download and use that to implement the survey. But another great resource that we have available is something that was developed by our Research Alliance members at the North Dakota REL Center. And they were wanting to share the survey with their districts in North Dakota to allow them to actually administer the survey online and look at the responses to the survey. So they actually created Google Forms that allow you to implement the survey online, and you can implement the survey as it's currently written, or you can actually adjust the survey also. So you could select items that you didn't want to include. So if there are some items that, even though they were relevant to the states and the districts that we were working with that aren't relevant in your situation, you could pull some of those items off, and you actually have the opportunity to add other items as well. I would caution that if you do that, the reliability and validity analysis that we provided wouldn't necessarily show the same results, but for just the purposes of thinking about feedback in your district, you could definitely make some adjustments to it. So on the REL Central website, at the link that's provided up here, you can go and see step-by-step instructions about how to use a Google form to create an online survey, and how to also use it to view responses to the survey after you administer it. And then there's also an instructional video that actually shows you, just walks through step by step and does, shows someone creating the survey using the form. So you can use either of those resources if you're interested in administering the survey on your own. So this is just example data. It's not real responses that were received, but just to show you what data might look like if you were to administer the survey. So this is looking at individual items within the category of usefulness. So all of the items along the left-hand side, teachers were asked to indicate the extent to which they agreed with each of those statements. And the graph shows the percent responding who responded from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And the way that the chart is set up is the neutral category is kind of used as a central point, just so you can see, visually see how certain items had higher levels of agreement than other items in this case.
And Judy, I know you said that this was just sample data, but as an educator, I was looking through this and I was thinking that it was probably pretty representative of a lot of the situations that I've been in. So I didn't know if this was representative of some of the typical of what you saw with data, or whether this was pulled out of the hat.
Yeah, so it is. We did look at the pilot data and the other data and kind of looked at what we saw, and also thought about our experience, like I said, in conducting research of other evaluation systems and information we've received from teachers. And really, you do see that it's when you get down to the specificity that you start to see less of that happening. So I think in just thinking about other information that you might gather, so a survey is a good way to start to collect information, but as a district or a state, it might be helpful to gather some more in-depth information. So if you did see that the feedback wasn't including specific suggestions, then you might actually try to have some interviews or focus groups with teachers to ask them about ways that feedback could be provided that might be more specific, or what type of feedback did they receive. You might talk to your evaluators and get some information to see what type of suggestions they were providing, and then maybe help to think about how to develop training to help them make their suggestions more specific, or if they maybe thought that they didn't have the knowledge to make those more specific suggestions, then starting to think about who else could the evaluator turn to help them think about specific suggestions that they could make to help the teacher improve their content or subject knowledge or their instructional strategies. So I just think that there's lots of different ways that you could respond to this, and probably a lot of other questions that you would have if you were to administer the survey that you might want to follow up with. I do know that in Missouri they actually used this survey and administered it as a pre and post to kind of look at whether or not teachers' perceptions of evaluator feedback changed after they had evaluators actually participate in some training around how to provide good feedback. So that's another way that it has been used and could potentially be used, is just to kind of look at whether or not perceptions are changing as you're conducting more training for evaluators on how to provide good feedback.
Excellent. I think that concludes this webinar. We do want to thank you very much for attending. We do hope that you found it useful, and we thank you very much for participating in our webinar.